CEO of the Alliance for Water Efficiency. We are an international nonprofit organization dedicated to the efficient and sustainable use of water. And we're very pleased today to present a webinar to you on the subject of conservation rates and revenue loss. And we've entitled it, Our Current Revenue Loss Dilemma: Is Consumer Conservation Really the Culprit? And the reason we wanted to bring this webinar to you today, this introductory webinar, is to talk about this issue and to try and set the stage for how we can perceive conservation with respect to the revenue losses that all of our water utilities are facing all across North America and elsewhere. We know that you as a conservation professional are concerned about the integrity of your programs and wanting to be able to maintain your budget and maintain your message about conservation's effectiveness, and it's very hard to do that when you're being accused of eroding the revenue of your water utility in your community. So this is a webinar that attempts to talk about not only that problem, but what we at the Alliance for Water Efficiency are doing to help provide you with tools to deal with it. So just a few housekeeping instructions just to start off with. This webinar will be 60 minutes in length. We want to give you lots of time for questions, so I'll probably speak about 45 minutes or so, maybe a little less. The audio, which you likely already have found if you hear my voice, is through your telephone or through your computer. You have your choice. And the way we will handle questions is you need to type them in the dialog box that's in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you see a little orange box with a white arrow in it, and click that arrow, it will open up a dialog box where you can then type a question to us. You can do that at any time through the webinar itself. We'd be happy to accumulate the questions and answer them at the end. And the reason you can't do that yourself in terms of a voice question is that we have muted the webinar phone line as we are recording this webinar. We are attempting to provide a recorded version that we can make available on our website for those of you who were not able to be part of our webinar presentation today. So that way, with your phone line muted, you don't have to worry about the ambient noises from your desk, the phones ringing and people knocking on your door and papers rustling and you're typing, etc. So we'll have a clean recording that way. So please excuse the fact that it's muted, but we have plenty of opportunity to communicate with you through the dialog box that Jeffrey, who was with me on the call, will be monitoring. So what are the goals that we have for our webinar today? We want to first discuss the factors that contribute to what we are seeing in declining water demand and declining water sales. We want to look at the political realities of getting rate increases approved, not only by your elected officials, but getting approved and accepted by your customers. We'd like to look at the role of conservation, both in the positive and negative sense. And we'd like to investigate solution options for this dilemma. We'll be describing the project that the Alliance is undertaking to come up with those options. And we want to also just talk in general about educating, informing, and convincing the consumer of the value of water and the value of paying for it appropriately. So let's start by taking a look at one particular state. I've taken the state's name off of this chart because it doesn't really matter what state it is. This is a phenomenon we're seeing all across the country. We're seeing that as gross state product increases and the economy goes up or goes down, in this case, of course, from 1975 to 2001, it was on a steady trend upwards, and population also on a steady trend upwards. But take a look at the total water withdrawal line, which is the green dotted line on the bottom of the screen. That is actually separating out from population around 1980 or so and trending away from that red line. It was together with that red line of population for many, many decades. But around 1980 or so, it began to really dip and change. And this has now been nicknamed the new normal. This declining water withdrawals and water demand is this new normal that we're facing in the water utility industry. And unfortunately, water utilities haven't always been accurately forecasting this new normal when projecting their water sales. They've not been projecting it to be as deep as it really is, and thereby causing gaps between the sales forecast and the actual revenue collected. And when presented with this sorry state of affairs, water supplier board members are hesitant to do the entire solution that's being recommended in terms of a revenue collection option and a rate structure change, and often they either don't approve them or approve the rates only in part, meaning that they're under-collecting based on the cost that they truly have. So we're seeing this phenomenon all across the United States and in Canada as well. Here's a chart showing water usage in U.S. cities. I think it's really interesting. This is a chart published by the Water Research Foundation in 2010. And it shows a number of cities both in what we would consider classic, high rainfall, wet environments, as well as dry cities in desert areas, arid areas. But all of these lines are trending downwards. It doesn't almost matter where you are. The most obvious example is Las Vegas in the top line with the triangles, the orange triangles. So Las Vegas really has experienced some sharp declines in water usage due to a variety of factors, but you see it in Phoenix and you see it in a number of other cities as well. It's all in general declining downwards. And that of course results, declining demand and declining usage results in declining water sales. So here's a chart from the National Association of Water Companies. This is a private investor-owned trade association, and they've plotted annual residential gallons sold per residential customer. And you can see this line was pretty much up and down during the 90s, but it's sharply trending downward now from 2000 on. It's a very deep dive in terms of sales, which is of course a deep dive in terms of revenue. So isn't this a success story? I mean, we're in conservation. Doesn't this mean to us that have achieved some great victory? Well, our managers don't like it. They're happy that we have, of course, achieved our goals, perhaps, but not happy about what they perceive as the negative effect it's had on their revenue. And almost invariably, conservation gets singled out as the biggest reason that these sales are declining. It's not true that it's the only reason, but it is often singled out as the most visible reason because the customer is involved in conservation, so the customer can also be blamed for the reduction in revenue coming to the utility. Lower demand means reduced revenue. There's just no two ways about it. And if you don't plan for that lower demand and adjust your rates beforehand, you end up in a difficult situation. And these reduced sales mean you're not collecting enough revenue to cover your fixed costs. And the fixed costs are in two distinct categories. One is the short-run variable costs, that is the costs associated with buying the water, with pumping it, using energy, electric energy to pump it, chemicals to treat it. Those are all costs that are associated with each incremental gallon of water that is used. But there's also long-run capacity costs, and those are largely capital expenditures for supply development, transmission of that supply, storage of it, treatment of it, both on the drinking water side and even treatment on the wastewater side. All of those costs are fixed based on bonded indebtedness, and those fixed costs have to be paid independent of how much revenue is collected. So if you're not fully covering your fixed costs, you're in a world of hurt. And revenue stability now becomes the paramount issue that is facing your board and facing your managers. It is now seemingly all that anyone is talking about. At a recent conference of the American Water Works Association in Denver last week, virtually every conservation presentation I attended had a question in the audience that said, gee, this is great that you got these savings. How are you adjusting for the loss in revenue that these savings are resulting in? I mean, this is paramount now on everybody's mind. So what causes revenue instability? What are the factors? You've got reduced demand coming from codes and standards. We are now replacing fixtures that have been using high amounts of water for decades. We're replacing them now with efficient fixtures that are mandated by the plumbing and appliance codes that have been in effect since 1992. Some states like Georgia, Texas, and California go even beyond the federal standard in what they will be requiring for plumbing beginning in 2014. And this has a very strong dampening effect on demand as consumers are changing out their appliances. As they don't have money now to buy new houses, they are remodeling their bathrooms in their existing houses. And all of a sudden water use is diminishing with these replacements. Then, of course, there's demand reduced from active conservation programs. That's what we want to do. We are doing conservation because we're trying to reduce a very high per capita water usage in this country. So we know that there's reduced demand coming from that. But there's also reduced demand from other factors. The recession is certainly a big one. You know, we're going to be looking, the Water Research Foundation in particular is going to be conducting a study to examine the actual effects of this recent recession on water utility water demand. And we'll have a better handle on which area of the country is experiencing the worst effects. But there's no doubt about it that many parts of the country with foreclosed homes, with industrial shift layoffs, with industries moving altogether out of the area, all of these factors resulted in sharp decreases in consumption for the sectors that were affected by the recession. So while the jury is still out yet on how much effect that is, there's no question that there is an effect. There's also been reduced peak demand because we've had some wet years in a row. And when we have wet years, of course, we don't use as much outdoor irrigation water, and that is usually very high, expensive tail block revenue for water utilities. If they don't get it, then that's part of their revenue shortfall. Then you have increased costs. That's part of that revenue instability equation because your costs are going up as your revenue is going down. And infrastructure maintenance has been deferred, as we all know, for years and years. It's always easier to put off that needed pipe or meter replacement program while the funds weren't there this year. Maybe we'll do the rate increase next year to cover it. And so infrastructure replacement and repair has been delayed so long that now it's at a critical point, and many systems has to be dealt with now. Those costs are rising. There's a rise in other fixed costs too related to system maintenance, labor, health insurance, energy costs. All of these costs are rising, and then there's continuing inflation. This is all, a mixed cocktail of factors that have caused this revenue instability problem. So the effects of revenue instability have been looked at by Michigan State University. We know the water prices inevitably must rise, and there's great work being done by Jan Beecher at the Institute of Public Utilities at Michigan State, and she's taking a close look at what the situation is in terms of the revenue collection and the rise in costs, trends in consumer prices, etc. And she's doing a lot of work, and it's posted on her website. I've given you her URL so that you can go and take a look. Here's an example of one of her charts. I think on her website this one is actually updated to 2012. But what you can see in this particular chart is that water and sewer is tracking much higher in terms of the rise in consumer prices than any of the other utilities in this mix. And so we're right up there with cable and garbage, two utilities that of course our customers all love to hate. And so we're rising very quickly, just as fast as they are. You can see the spike in fuel oil is probably the only other one that's marginally close to what we're looking at here. And so as others are declining, look at interstate phone, for example, water now is beginning to skyrocket and trend upwards. A paper was recently published by Sanjay Gar in the American Water Works Association Journal, where he annualized rate increases for some counties in California from 2003 to 2011, and they ranged from a low of 4.7% per year to 15.9% per year. So we're now beginning to look at some rather sharp increases that we hadn't ever had before. So to state the problem, in sort of four simple ways, the extent of the reduced demand and the reduced sales is catching some utilities by surprise. They have been able to do what they've always done, straight line extrapolation of their per capita across population growth. There never was a reason to deviate from that simple type of demand forecasting. And the types of factors that are coming in, particularly the savings and the reduced demand from codes and standards affecting plumbing and appliance fixtures, that's caught a lot of managers by surprise. Water costs are rising faster than for other utilities, and those costs, again, if they haven't been accurately forecasted and put into the cost of service summaries, they're going to catch utility managers by surprise. Thirdly, we are bundling now water bills with other services. It used to be it was just the water bill, but now it's often the water and the sewer bill, or the water, the sewer, and the garbage bill, or the water and the sewer and the stormwater bill and the garbage bill. And so as we bundle more and more services into the water bill, it makes the rise in the customer bill look even worse in the eyes of the customer. Those double-digit increases are now not just about water, they're about all these other municipal services, but it's all bundled into one thing that the customer recognizes. And lastly, the customer really doesn't think much about their water bill or their rates or what effect shortages have on the quality of the service to them in their community. They often don't even look at their water bill anymore if they're on a direct pay program. So often the bill just goes into a digital storage cabinet somewhere and the amount of the payment is withdrawn from their bank account, and it isn't until that amount changes precipitously or they see in the paper it's about to change precipitously that they get mobilized. And they really don't have a good handle on what are the component pieces that make their water service so special. And we're partly to blame for that. We have spent many decades convincing the customer that we're the strong, silent provider, supplying drinking water in an affordable and safe way, and they need not think about it. We're taking care of you. And so we've largely disconnected ourselves from the customer. The customer doesn't really understand what utilities are going through at the moment. And weather is a part of that. Here's the U.S. Drought Monitor, the most recent map from June 11th. And it shows that drought's creeping back into the western part of the United States. It never really left Texas, but Texas is better than it was 2 years ago. But if you looked at the Drought Monitor 2 years ago, you would have seen that the map was largely white, with only Texas being in drought. And we were experiencing some rather wet weather during 2010, 2011, and that's a factor on water sales. As it rains, people's irrigation systems don't run as much, they don't sell as much irrigation water, and that's now becoming a very large part of residential water sales. In some parts of the West, as much as 80% of residential water use goes out into outdoor irrigation and landscape. So if you have a precipitous drop in 80% of your residential demand, and if residential demand is 66% of your customers, it's not a surprise that you've got some serious revenue shortfalls. But what happens when it rains? And when it rains, outdoor water use is lower. We have a reverse situation than when we have in a drought. In a drought, water suppliers are complaining that they need to have you conserve so that they don't have to get more expensive supplies or possibly even have to ration you. But in wet years, when outdoor water use comes down because it's raining quite a bit, the water suppliers then complain that they need to sell a little bit more water to meet the fixed costs. And we're seeing water suppliers in some regions of the country actually encouraging their customers to use water for that very reason. They're overcapacity. They would like to make more sales. So it's a seesaw situation. You're either in a drought or you're in an abundance where you need to sell more water. And so the costs that are avoided by the utility from conservation get forgotten in this drive to sell that excess capacity. Conservation is not viewed anymore as a benefit to the system. It's viewed as a detriment to getting more revenue in the coffers. And from the customer's side, it's even worse because when it rains a bit and reservoirs then become full, they expect the water bill to go down, not up when supplies are available. They don't perceive that their service is actually a utility service. It's not about unit blocks of water being delivered to you. It's about the actual provision of the service. And that continues whether it's wet or dry. So we have a customer education problem there. But basically the rate structures that we've designed can't deal with these wide swings from drought to wet weather where the revenue swings wildly. Unless you have a very large stabilization fund in your utility to buffer those wide swings, you're often caught very short. So what we need are properly designed rate structures that will stabilize the revenue collection process, stabilize the water utility systems in the community, and still provide a conservation message. That's what we're committed to doing at the Alliance for Water Efficiency. The political reality is the problem here. We don't like to revise our rates. If we didn't mind it, we wouldn't be in this conundrum. Revising the rates is very politically unpopular. Many water systems are governed by city councils or elected water board members. These politicians are often very interested in a long-term political career. This might be their first jumping point is the local water board elected seat, and the last thing they want to do is anger the voters by voting for a rate increase. So rates are often changed as little as possible. It's usually deferred to someone else's term. No, it's not going to be on my term. It's going to be somebody else's elected term that we're going to do this rate increase. And so the inevitable, necessary, inflationary increase in rates is postponed until suddenly it becomes a crisis. And often a simple increase, if it had been done at the time, 2 or 3%, suddenly becomes 15 or 20 or 30% when you wait a number of years. And as costs increase, then you're suddenly, if you don't do these rate increases, you don't have enough revenue to cover the costs. So conservation becomes blamed. It's the culprit. And it's an easy excuse to pass to the customer, well, gosh, we're sorry you did such a good job conserving that now we have to raise our rates to cover the missing revenue that we need to comply with our fixed cost requirements. And so even when the water utility doesn't have an active conservation program, they still say this message to the customer. We've seen this in numerous places where the customer is being told, well, we don't really want to raise your rates, but we have to because you have done such a great job conserving. And the media, of course, feeds that frenzy. You get a 30% rate increase, and it sounds horrible until you do the math on the average water bill and realize it's probably a $5 or $7 a month increase on the customer's water bill. So it's not the percent increase that's the issue. It is the impact to the average water bill that is really what we should be looking at in the absolute dollar terms. And so what about conservation? What do we say about conservation? Well, it's still a cost reducer to the utility. I mean, that's why we all do it. And thus it shouldn't be the sole scapegoat for revenue loss, because the revenue loss is due to a lot of other factors as well. In terms of reducing cost, every gallon saved is water that doesn't have to be pumped and treated and delivered to the customer. So you save variable operating costs with that conserved gallon. But really the big savings come when there's long-term infrastructure that's avoided or deferred because conservation has reduced the demand projected in the future for that capacity. So that is probably the most significant benefit, and that's where the reduced utility costs can end up meaning reduced rates for the customer in the long term. But you have to plan for that, and you have to actually model it and show at what point does that benefit kick in, and at what point does the rate need to be adjusted in order to collect the revenue that's necessary. And all systems appear to be growing somewhere, somehow. There are very few systems that are not growing at all. And Environmental Protection Agency does a study on a periodic basis. The last one was released in 2006, so we're due for a new one, of community water systems in the United States. And their last study showed that 52.6% of the capital improvement expenditures for water utilities around the country were for expansion, not just repair and replacement of broken pipes or needed meter replacement. It was for expansion of the system. So if half of the expenditures are for expansion, this is where conservation can become a real saver, financial benefit to the water utility, because if you can reduce the cost of that expansion, you're saving your customers millions of dollars. But again, planning for it long term is critical, and integrating it into your total strategy for not only supply sources but for revenue collection is very important. Here's a graph that sort of demonstrates that long-term infrastructure principle. It comes from the M52 manual of the American Water Works Association. And this is a stylized chart, but it does show if you estimated your baseline demand to grow across the years in this solid line, but then you instituted a conservation program that reduced the demand to what this level would be in this dotted line, you can see that you have actually extended your capacity where you would have run out in the year 2020. You've extended it to 2030. You have now saved what is 10 years of expansion Those 10 years are worth millions of dollars to your customers. The existing capacity could be anything. It could be a storage reservoir, it could be groundwater wells, it could be expansions to your drinking water treatment plant, it could be expansions or building of a wastewater treatment plant. Whatever you can delay or even downsize and defer into the future, you are saving your ratepayers millions of dollars, and that's where the benefit of conservation kicks in. So we've designed at the Alliance for Water Efficiency a spreadsheet tool that actually helps you calculate what that financial benefit is, particularly for the long-term infrastructure needs, but also for the short-term variable costs that you can avoid. This is the navigation screen for the Water Conservation Tracking tool. It's a very simple tool that we've built that 300 users are registered using it now across the country. And it does, what you would expect it would do, analyzes the water savings from particular conservation programs across classes of customers. It includes plumbing code savings in its analysis. It shows what the changes are in service area demands for your water utility, the dark blue line being that baseline demand, the red line being what the savings are from codes and standards if they're taken into account in the demand forecast. And then the bright green line is what the savings would be and what the demand would be with these active conservation programs. So it plots it across the years so you know exactly what your demands are. But more importantly, what we wanted to say was, yes, that's all fine, well, and good. Models have done that. But what we want to show you is how you have to change your revenue requirement to match those new trend lines in your demand. Because if you don't do that before you institute the conservation program, you will be in a penalty mode with your customers, as we so often see. So this particular chart shows for that same conservation set of options what the change in the utility revenue requirement would be under two different ways to finance it. So the blue bars show the increases that have to be made every year beginning in 2008 in this example in your revenue requirement to collect the revenue to adjust for the reduced sales from the conservation program as well as the costs of the conservation program. This is pay as you go. This is being paid out of current operating revenues, which is how most of you are funding your conservation programs. But if you look at the year 2015, you'll see that that year begins where all of a sudden it starts going below the zero line and you're making money for the utility because of those conservation savings, the avoided cost financial benefits. Now, if you debt financed your conservation program, like you debt finance all of your other supply options, then the red bars are the ones you would look at. And what they show you is you're saving money right up until that bond period runs out in 2022. You're not having to raise your revenue requirement at all because you're spreading the benefit of that conservation investment across the benefit period. In the pay-as-you-go, you're paying up front for what are years' worth of benefits. You're paying for it only in the first several years. It's no wonder we've got revenue loss. We're paying for it all up front. You wouldn't pay for a reservoir in the first year of building it. You pay for it over a 30-year period. Why would you pay for a toilet replacement program in anything less than the 20-year life of that toilet savings period? So this is kind of the problem we've got here in planning conservation programs, and one of the reasons we wanted to build this tool to show different ways of doing it. We also wanted to show you the difference in the average customer's water bill. So again, if you're doing pay-as-you-go, these are the increases you would have to make every year to the customer's water bill to then show the customer that beginning in 2014, it now becomes a positive benefit and makes their bill even go down. Under pay-as-you-go, it goes all the way out into 2023. I'm sorry, in the debt financing model, the red bars, it goes all the way out to 2023 before it starts showing impact that has to be adjusted to the average water bill. So these are the kinds of tools that we wanted to give water utilities to help them better plan for how conservation can have a positive impact and not negatively impact their revenue collection process. But we knew it was going to take more than just a model. So our first effort was putting together a rates and water pricing project with some Great Lakes Protection Fund money that we got through the Great Lakes Commission. So we held some workshops in 2010 in 4 areas around the Great Lakes, and we published this primer in 2011. It was written by Jan Beecher of Michigan State University for us, and it provides practical advice for water board elected officials, managers, and consumers on how you can do conservation-oriented water pricing. And although it says for the Great Lakes region, it's terrific advice that works everywhere in North America. And indeed, I think Jan has updated this document, removed the subtitle of the Great Lakes, and it's available on the Michigan State site, you know, in an updated version for everyone to see. I mean, this is all just great advice. But we knew we couldn't stop there. This issue was deepening. So in August of 2012, we hosted, together with the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread, a summit. It was funded by the Walton Family Foundation, and we had 30 high-level attendees, utility CEOs, CFOs, regulators, rate experts, economists, nonprofit advocates who work in the rate-setting sphere, all in a room together to talk about what they viewed the problems were with rates, conservation, and revenue loss. We prepared a summary of that summit, and it's on our website. You can download it. It's available free of charge. And in addition to the detailed summary of what happened at the summit, there is a background framing paper by Jan Beecher and Tom Chestnut that outlined all of the issues that are involved in this revenue instability topic that we're discussing. So I strongly encourage you to go to our website and download this document. But I wanted to just summarize a little bit of what we did at the summit, because I think it's very instructive for having you understand the project that we're going to be doing now going forward. We asked 5 basic questions of the summit attendees. How and why do you think water sales are declining? So I gave you my list earlier in this presentation. Everyone in the room had a different list. 2, how are water utility revenues falling short of revenue requirements? Why is this happening on a continuous basis? If you agree that it's happening, why is it happening? 3, do water utilities and the conservation community have a messaging problem? If we're not able to get these rate increases approved, why is that? What are the reasons for it? 4, what methods are available to repair our revenue loss situation and to improve fiscal stability for water utilities? And then 5, what role do industry standards practices and policy reforms play in developing solutions to this problem? So we had, as I say, a number of very key people at this summit. It was a day and a half, so in a day and a half we can't solve this problem that's been brewing for now at least a decade. But we made some great progress in defining the terms of the problem and in figuring out the path that we need to take going forward. And of course the revenue shortfall predominated, it's predominantly the discussion that we had through most of the summit. And we talked about all kinds of different methods for adjusting this revenue shortfall, from rate adjustments on a much more regular basis. Ideally a little adjustment every year is better than a whopping adjustment every 5. Improved cost forecasting. We need a better sense of how these costs are varying and being able to predict in an improved risk scenario what those costs are going to be in the future. This especially relates to infrastructure maintenance. We need to better improve our demand forecasting. We need to really understand this new normal, the declining demand, what role codes and standards are playing in that, and how much to discount for that. Some utilities are doing as much as 1% per year just based on the codes and standards changes. We need to understand better weather normalization. These wide swings in weather that I talked about earlier, they need to be factored in scenario planning for demand forecasting and sales forecasting. Perhaps we need to investigate some cost adjustment mechanisms. We've had them in energy forever. Why don't we look at doing something similar to that in water, where you don't have to go back out to the ratepayer or to the elected board to adjust the rates due to some fixed cost that is very predictable and documented elsewhere. Cost index rates is another strategy, another form of doing that. But these are mechanisms that we haven't really looked at a lot as a utility industry, and maybe there's a kernel of a solution in there. Demand repression adjustments, to try and to keep customers still thinking about conservation and the need to keep water use down and reducing costs in the system, but figuring out a way that it still can make revenue a little bit more stable. And then just designing a rate structure to start with that is more revenue stable. You know, making sure that you have the ability to cope with wide variations in revenue collection and still make fixed costs. Property-based fire protection charges were emerging as a topic of conversation. Somehow this has to be woven into the solution as well. So some of the improvement recommendations made during the summit were better forecasted demand on codes and standards. We've talked about that. Compensate for the uncertainty of future sales by developing some form of risk compensation strategy. And there were some interesting topics that came out in this particular discussion. You know, are derivatives something we should look at in the utility industry as a way to you know, hedge against what is going to be an extremely dry year or an extremely wet year? How can we harness the risk compensation strategies that are out there in the marketplace to help water utilities? So that's something to look at. How do we quantify the response of water demand to changes in rates and other external factors? This gets at the classic issue of demand elasticity, and we have always traditionally thought of water as being very inelastic indoors, but elastic outdoors, depending upon the situation. And what we would like to do is figure out what the extent of the elasticity is so that you can better predict how a change in rate is going to affect customer consumption. Need to adjust your revenue collection mechanism annually. That's pretty much what everybody in the room said. We know we need to do it, we just don't like doing it. We know it's painful. We're humans, we like to avoid pain, and raising rates is very painful. But it's more painful the longer you wait. It's kind of like deferring going to the dentist. Pay me now or pay me later. It's worse when it's later. Account for the water savings actually achieved by the conservation programs. This was a big point because we are no longer studying conservation savings as we used to. I've been in this field for quite a while, and in the 90s we did a lot of conservation studies. We did econometric analyses. We really computed how our conservation programs achieved savings in the field. And now no one's doing it anymore. We're not seeing the studies come out of the true conservation savings, and we're relying on engineering projections which may or may not be accurate. We may be overestimating or underestimating. When you just take the number of widgets installed by the number of customers, that doesn't give you a sense of how that widget is performing in the field or what the customer is doing with that widget. You have to look at metered records. And those studies are expensive, and in this economy those studies are getting cut. So if you don't know what the savings are that you're really getting, you don't know what the value is to your system financially. It's a very important problem to solve. And then tied with that is estimating the future cost-effective potential for conservation. We're not done yet, although some areas of the country might say they are. There always is going to be some cost-effective potential out there for you, and you need to estimate what that is so that you don't overinvest if it's not cost-effective. It's an important reason why we built our water conservation tracking tool, to help people determine what that benefit cost breakpoint is for each system, because it's very system unique and system dependent. And then educating the customer. We spent a lot of time at this summit recognizing that we have done a pretty poor job of educating our customers, because we have kept them somewhat at a distance. You know, trust us, we're delivering you the best drinking water in the world, and it's true, but they don't have a sense for appreciating what they have, and they'd rather pay 10,000 times more for it per gallon out of a plastic bottle than they do out of the tap. We have a huge educational burden to overcome. If they don't value the water, they're not going to want to pay for it. So what's next on this issue for us here at the Alliance for Water Efficiency? We wanted to start with this introductory webinar to basically explain to you what some of the project issues were that we're working on and what we will be rolling out over the course of the next year. This year in 2013, we're going to be working with Stanford University on some rates modeling to get at that elasticity issue that I discussed earlier. We've got utilities that are participating with metered data sets. If that's something you're interested in, let us know. Anyone who participates in that project gets early access to the rates model. We're also going to be preparing a handbook for achieving efficiency-oriented revenue stability. What that means is, sure, we could design rate structures that are revenue stable, but they wouldn't be very water conservation oriented. And we, of course, would like to do both. We would like to help utilities be revenue stable and encourage them to get more efficient water use from their customers. And it's a fine line, and we're hoping to come up with some great models to show you to do that. And so accompanying the handbook will be some rate spreadsheets that will be tools for utilities to use in mapping out what might work for them. And that all will probably take the better part of 2013, beginning of 2014. And then later on in 2014, we'll do a second solution summit at Wingspread. We'll convene all those same wonderful experts back and say, okay, you outlined the problems. Now here's a set of proposed solutions. What do you think of these? We'll also be launching something we're calling the Digital Rates Resource Hub. On the Alliance for Water Efficiency website. It'll be a go-to location for lots of rate and revenue information. And in particular, we want to provide information on successful consumer campaigns that have resulted in getting to yes on a rate increase. We all know how to get to no. We've all been there on the no side. But how do you get to yes? How do you get happy customers, and invested water board and elected official approval? That's what we want to help you all with. So stay tuned. We'll have more webinars and workshops to follow as our rates work evolves and as we complete it. We'd like to have some specific webinars on solution options for water rates. You know, for example, I'd like to do a webinar in the next several months on water budget-based rates. We get lots of questions on that, so I think that would be a great topic to showcase as one of the options available. And so we're also looking for utility partners to provide data and feedback to us in this process and to help us pilot some rate structure redesign. You know, as we come up with some interesting solutions, we would like to have you you know, volunteer to be part of our testing process and utilize the consultant resources that we will have to help pilot a solution for you. So if that's something that appeals to you, let us know. And just to finish here, a key piece of the work that we're doing will involve consumer messaging, because we believe that's part of the problem. An informed and educated consumer is going to be a consumer who will care about the quality of their water, where it comes from, and how it's being used. And we see that occurs very strongly in parts of the country where people are much more connected to the source of their water supply than they are if they just think of it as water coming from the tap. So we designed a program that we offer free to our members at the Alliance. And this particular program emphasizes the issues of not wasting water in our typical way that we do every single day. So we called it Never Waste. And the ads that we've prepared in this campaign are trying to get the consumer to think about the amount of water that they waste just with doing the normal things they do every day. So here's an ad that says a broken sprinkler head can waste 384 of these bottles in 10 minutes. So everybody sees this stainless steel 20-ounce water bottle. They know roughly what size that is, but they can envision 384 of those in 10 minutes. Wow, that's a lot of water. Or if leaving the water on while you shave wastes 32 of these, or running toilet wastes 800 of these in a day. I mean, these are all messages that help the consumer begin to think about the water that's there. And it's tied to our Home Waterworks website, which if you haven't visited it, we would urge you to do so. It's a benefit that we again provide to our members. It's a consumer-oriented site. This site right now does not have a section on rates and pricing, but we would love to add a section to it to help the consumer understand why their water is priced the way it is. But the fundamental piece of the site gets at a water calculator and sending them on a little treasure hunt to find where they use water in their home and how they can use water more efficiently. And that water calculator has a component of education with it, not only about the connection with energy and greenhouse gas emissions, but typically how much water they use compared to their neighbors or compared to a real water efficient home, like a WaterSense home. So that's the consumer education program that we have launched just this year at the Alliance for Water Efficiency. Here's our website. If you haven't visited us on our website, I encourage you to do so. You can just type in allianceforwaterefficiency.org. We have a very detailed rates section in our resource library. So if you go to the resource library tab on that navigation bar and click down, you'll see water rates. Just click in, you'll see lots of information. And we also, of course, have our summit summary that you should take a look at. But we'd love to have you part of our project, so I wanted to just close this webinar by thanking you for attending and for being part of this discussion. We'd love to answer any questions that you might have, and if your question isn't answered on the webinar, we have about 15 minutes, I see here, to do questions, but if your question isn't answered, please feel free to call us at the office. Our number is listed in the lower left-hand corner, and we'd be happy to talk with you further about the project. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Jeffrey to see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Marianne. We actually do. We have about half dozen or so. Some might go quicker than others, but I'll read them in order of receipt. Right off the bat, someone was interested in wanting to know whether the slides will be available online for download.
Well, as I mentioned, we are recording this webinar, so we will definitely post the recording if it comes out all right. We also will we can post the slides as well. We can do that probably by the end of the day today.
Thank you. When you were talking of trends, someone here was interested in, are electric and natural gas consumption also trending down?
Energy is trending up. There are always new uses for energy, as we know in our highly technological world. So electricity in particular is trending up. Per capita energy use may be trending down in places like California and Vermont and states that have made a serious commitment to energy conservation and efficiency. But in general, total energy use is trending up. And that is different than what we are experiencing in water. We're not creating new uses for water. Whereas in energy, there's always new products, new technological developments that all need electricity. So I think the problem is different for us than for other energy sectors.
Thank you. Question here is, when will the Water Research Foundation study be completed on the effects of recession on water demands?
That study has just been undertaken. At the meeting last week in Denver, they announced that they had selected a consultant team from Hazen and Sawyer to do the analysis. It's probably going to be about a year before that study is completed. And what the study is attempting to do is to analyze the impacts of this particular recession on water utility demands. So Jack Kiefer is the principal investigator, and we can find out from him the more detailed timeline, but I think he said it would be about a year before they would have any results.
Thank you. Regarding when you were speaking to bundling of utility services, question here is, or statement, if water cost rates are rising faster than for other utilities, then bundling water bills with other utilities should reduce the apparent percentage in the bills. Yes?
Yes, that is true. So it does mask the fact that water is increasing higher, but it still makes the overall bill bigger than what it would be if it were just water. So if you're looking at the impact to the customer, percentage increases don't really mean anything until you convert it to what the customer's bill is going to be. The traditional way to look at this is taking an average bill, maybe somewhere near the lifeline rate if you're a utility that has a lifeline rate, and figuring out what the difference is going to be for that average customer. So that bill will be higher in a bundled scenario. And it's all really, even though what you're saying is logical, it's all about perception. And the perception still is that it's all the water bill. That's generally what we hear our public affairs folks telling us in the water utilities, is that their customers perceive it is the water bill, even though it includes all of these other factors, including stormwater and including some other sustainability charges that may be lumped in by the community. And then there's another factor at work here, which is that if the utility has a rate stabilization fund to help it through these wide swings and rate adjustment periods, sometimes that fund is rated by the local city council to help defer general fund revenue needs. So if water utility revenues are not protected in an enterprise type fund that keeps it separate from the general fund of the community, sometimes those water funds are actually transferred over to pay other services like fire and police protection. And we see that happening a lot too. There are very few places where that's prohibited in municipal systems. And that's a further drain on utility revenues, which then creates the need for further rate increases. So it's a tough situation.
Okay, thank you. Question here, have you found that it's common for agencies to have two sets of demand forecasting numbers, say one for establishing rates and another for long-term water supply reliability planning?
It is very typical to have multiple demand scenarios, and it's recommended that you have multiple demand scenarios for accurately planning for different drought and hydrological events. So for long-term planning, you need to do a dry year extrapolation, wet year extrapolation, and average year extrapolation, and project that in terms of long-term planning. But you need to do sales forecasts for your immediate near term that are going to help you make sure you're conservatively planning for adequate revenue collection. And that's what we're finding isn't happening quite as much as it should. It's rather than being conservative and collecting more and covering those costs, they tend to wait too long until that rate increase kicks in, and then they're revenue short and they have to dip into the revenue fund if they have one. So it's the matchup of the sales forecast to the demand forecast and doing it from a risk perspective to cover all bases. That's part of what we need to help water utility planners do. And the handbook is going to deal with this in a very direct way. This is one of the big issues that we would like to cover.
Okay, thank you. A couple questions here regarding the water conservation tracking tool. The first one being, does the tracking tool build in the impact of plumbing standards on water use and rates?
Yes, that's one of the major things that the tracking tool does. Even if you didn't put in any conservation programs, active programs that the utility would pay for, the tracking tool will show you how your demand will change over time purely due to the plumbing code. And that's one of the things we wanted to make sure this did, so that we could give demand forecasters the ability to see what the impact of the codes would be for them in their state. So we have a tracking tool version for California and Texas. We have a different tracking tool version for Georgia. We have versions based on what the plumbing code and appliance code requirements are in those particular areas. So that's a very big feature of the tracking tool.
Thank you. The second question relating to the tracking tool is, can the tracking tool show clearly the forecast costs related to reduced water use? Is there other work that should be done in this area?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but when you say increased forecast costs, a forecast is something that utilities do anyway. The quality of the forecast is something different. So if you're saying you want to hire a consultant to do a better quality forecast, would the tracking tool have the ability to show that as a cost? The answer is yes. The tracking tool can be fully customized to your utility, not only your utility system, but what you're paying in terms of costs and services. So there are fields where you can enter what you're paying for improved forecasting if you wanted to make that part of the benefit cost analysis on the conservation program. But I would argue that that isn't a function of conservation only. I mean, better forecasting is better management for the entire utility. It's not just a conservation cost. But if you wanted to show it that way, you could. The tracking tool will allow you to do that.
Thank you.
And just as a final clarification, the tracking tool is available free of charge if you join the Alliance for Water Efficiency. It's one of our member benefits.
Wonderful. Thank you. Back to general questions. And this is a long one, so bear with me. What about enhancing revenue through scheduled meter changeouts and CI meter testing and repair for increased meter accuracy? or proper pressure management in utility systems to reduce main breaks and save utility expenditures on infrastructure.
These are all really good things, and these, what you've just read reads like a great list of utility management practices, best management practices. Controlling water loss and reducing your non-revenue water is probably the most important thing you can do to keep your costs down, because you're producing this water that then you're leaking out your pipe, or that you're not even registering correctly in accurate meter readings. So yes, these are important investments, and the tracking tool will help you estimate what the cost of that renovation is. If you're putting in, say, smart meters, you could build a program for analyzing, smart meter installation, the cost effectiveness of it. How long would it take you before it becomes, a true payback period? But it is all part of general utility management, and the better managed the utility is, the lower long-term its costs are going to be, because main breaks and system pipe failures are exceedingly expensive to repair, and they cost much more than if you would have maintained the system properly to begin with. So conservation measures that we encourage people to look at are not only better meter replacement, lower resolution meters to record better, low flows on the residential side, more accurate meters to measure commercial and industrial consumption so that you get adequate revenue back to the utility, and making sure that the utility's cash register is working. And the meters are the cash register. So if meters are not functioning properly, if they're under registering, that's further deepening your revenue instability problem, because you're not collecting the revenue that you really are owed. So that's all part of the solution as well.
Thanks, Marianne. Here's a statement that someone wrote in relating annual small rate increases, rate stabilization fund, and business efficiency improvements do work. Our agency has fared well over the past 4 years.
It's wonderful to hear that. Thank you for writing it, because it's very rare to see annual rate increases. They're hard to do, and I commend you that you've been able to do them. But hearing that you say that it does work and the customers they're adjusting to it, that's wonderful to hear.
Great.
Hello?
Buying. Hello?
Hello, are you still there?
I am. Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. Question again, back on the tracking tool, is can the tracking tool take an account of efficiency improvements in what customers are buying that may far exceed code requirements, for example, washing machines or dual flush toilets?
The tracking tool is a model that's designed to measure the impact of the programs that you as a utility member are sponsoring. So if you are providing a rebate to those customers to get more efficient appliances, so let's take an example. Say you want to rebate WaterSense toilets at the 1.28 gallon per flush level rather than the 1.6 gallon per flush level that's federally required. Would the tracking tool measure those differences? The answer is yes.
Great. Thank you for that. Last question I have here so far is, are we, the Alliance, looking at consumption-based fixed charges as a rate structure option that both provides a conservation price signal while making revenue extremely predictable?
That is one of the options. Yes, the answer is yes. That is one of the options that we will be looking at in our handbook, and that we will likely be featuring in future webinars and workshops. As I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this is an introductory webinar meant to sort of set the stage for the problem. We plan to do a series of these across the year, and we'll be showcasing solutions that people can investigate and explore as possible solutions for their community. And I know that the City of Davis has instituted a rate structure very similar to this, and we would of course love to have them talk about their experience with it.
Great, thank you. There are no other questions.
Great. Well, thank you. It looks like we finished right on time. So thank you all very much for hanging with us and being part of this webinar. And we invite you to be part of our future discussions as we continue to explore this topic and hopefully develop tools that will help you in your conservation and rate setting exercises. So thank you very much for joining us.